Hello there, and welcome to our reflections on Thursday, the 30th of April. I want to think about silence this evening. I've been continuing to read Abbot Christopher Jameson's book, Finding Sanctuary, and there is a chapter on there about how silence can help us find sanctuary, indeed, as the first step to finding sanctuary. You may be uncomfortable with silence. You may struggle to find silence. It's kind of ironic today that as I've been trying to find space to record this message for this evening, that the building work that's been going on next door to us has been particularly noisy. And so I've struggled to find a moment of silence in which I can take this time and space to talk. But finding silence is important. You may be uncomfortable with it, as I say. You've probably experienced uncomfortable silences either at parties or dinners or in conversations with people or in meetings. But there are times when silence is so very valuable, even, I would say, absolutely essential. And that's what Christopher Jameson would say in his book. In worship, we often talk about having times of silence, but rarely keep them. I was taught by a wise person many years ago that if you are going to say in a time of worship that you're going to hold a time of silence, that time needs to be at least 30 seconds. That can seem a long time. Try keeping silent for 30 seconds. In the past, I've been used to leading times of worship that involved 2 or 3 sessions of silence of up to 5 minutes each. And indeed, we know our Quaker brothers and sisters are used to keeping silence for great lengths of time. I could, I suppose, if I took this to the extreme, even sit here for 10 minutes in complete silence and allow that to be our reflection for this evening. If that's what you prefer, then please turn off and just keep silence for 10 minutes. But there's other times when I've been used to keeping silence. Many, many years ago when I used to volunteer for the Samaritans. Keeping silence or not being afraid to let silence sit between you and the person you were talking with, either on the phone or face to face, was something we were encouraged to allow. Silence in pastoral visiting, either because somebody is tired or ill or near the end of their life, is often something I find. We should not be afraid of those times of silence, of simply being in one another's presence and allowing ourselves together to be in God's presence. You may remember or think of times when silence has been comforting, either in the countryside or maybe at the top of a mountain is one of my favourite experiences of silence. Or when you've listened or sat beside your child sleeping and the silence that comes as you listen to their breathing. Or maybe the silence that you find if you sit in church on your own or in a cathedral. Maybe this is one of the reasons why cathedrals are becoming particularly popular again these days. Is because of the silence we can find there. Indeed, there are a number of times, and I know other people who like to sit as I do in the sanctuary space in St Andrews and just embrace the silence of being there. Silence, of course, is not merely or simply the absence of sound. It is the setting aside of noise. This is positive silence as opposed to negative silence. Monks, it has been said, in their monasteries for centuries upon centuries, have background silence in the same way that many people will have background music. Some of you will know that I struggle to have background music when I'm working or reflecting or writing. I prefer silence because the space helps me to think. But that's a personal preference. Nevertheless, it is important for each of us to find silence at times. We may face disruption, particularly at the moment. Obviously, I have 3 children living at home. This may be harder for those of you that have infant children at home. But believe me, it's equally hard when you have 3 teenagers at home and they're all doing different things in different parts of the house, some of which involves stomping about or shouting at each other. Silence is sometimes difficult to find, but there are ways we can set aside the noise and still embrace silence. Sometimes it helps us to find a place, a specific place within your house, maybe a chair, a corner where you like to sit that might be useful for you as a place to embrace times of silence. But maybe you find the idea of silence not only difficult but actually self-indulgent. Well, I would ask you or invite you to guard against that. It is not. I would say, as I've already said, it is essential. You may think silence is of no use. Again, I would say it is essential. I want to share with you a story. Again, it's a story from the Desert Fathers that Christopher Jameson recounts in his book. A story that's possibly 1,500 years or more old. A story about silence. Listen to this. There were 3 earnest men who were friends and became monks. One chose to live out the saying, "Blessed are the peacemakers," and worked to reconcile enemies. The second chose to visit the sick. But the third stayed in solitude. Now the first worked among many contentious people and found that he could not appease them all, so eventually he was overcome with exhaustion. He sought out his friend who was caring for the sick, only to find that he too was worn out, depressed, and unable to carry on. The 2 of them decided to visit their friend who lived in the desert, and they told him all their troubles. When they asked him how he was, the monk was silent for a while, and then poured some water into a bowl. "Look at the water," he said. And they saw that it was murky. After a while he said, "Look again, and see how clear the water has become." As they looked, the 2 monks saw their faces as in a mirror. And the monk said to his friends, "Because of the turbulence of life, the one who lives in the midst of activity does not see his sins. But when he is quiet, especially in solitude, then he sees the real state of things." Finding silence is not indulgent. It's essential, I believe. There is little mentioned directly about silence in the Bible, although there are times when we hear Jesus needs to go away to places as if to find silence or to retreat or to set aside, to stand aside from all that is going on in terms of busyness. I want to read to you a passage from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 6, beginning at verse 45. Immediately he made his disciples get into a boat and go ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up a mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the lake, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the lake. He intended to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. They all saw him and were terrified, but immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. We hear there both about Jesus taking time or setting aside time for his disciples and for himself to go up the mountain to pray, and then creating stillness, creating calm, creating, as it were, a silence. Let's embrace silence as part of our search for sanctuary. Let us pray together. And again, I'm drawing from the Iona Abbey Worship Book, from the Service of Quiet. God within and beyond us all, teach us the silence of humility, the silence of wisdom, the silence of love, and the silence of faith, the silence that enables reflection and speaks without words. Teach us, God, to silence our own hearts and minds that we may listen. Listen for the movement of your Spirit within us, and treasure your presence in the depths of our being. Amen. Silence is not an easy thing to find, but it is essential. Good night. God bless. Go well.